Hello everybody and welcome to our latest webinar. Thank you very much for joining us. Start off with a very brief introduction to myself. I'm Phil Underwood. I'm the Engagement Manager here at the Society for the Environment. I'm going to be handing over to our expert speakers very shortly before popping back to conclude the webinar with a question and answer opportunity. For those watching as a recording, if you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at any time after the webinar using the details on your screen now. A very brief introduction to the Society for the Environment. Essentially, you're watching a Society for the Environment webinar. We hold a Royal Charter, which was awarded in 2004. This allows us to register environmental professionals as Chartered Environmentalists and registered environmental technicians. The Society operates as an umbrella organisation, currently made up of 24 wonderful professional bodies known as our licensed members. All of these professional bodies hold a licence granted by the Society to award the CEnv registration to their members. And those that are highlighted on your screen now also offer the Registered Environmental Technician registration, also known as REnv Tech. To become a CEnv or an REnv Tech, you'll need to be a member of and apply via one of these professional bodies. The total number of CEnvs and REnv Techs currently adds up to nearly 7,500 globally. And we've got a number of those listening today. If you want to find more about becoming a CEnv or an REnv Tech, please visit the website socenv.org.uk, which is at the foot of your screen at the moment, or inquire directly with your preferred professional body. Right, so that's enough of that. This is the third of our expert-led series of webinars. These series will provide perspectives from across the wide knowledge spectrum that is our registrant base and the sectors that they cover. This is to increase knowledge transfer opportunities for our registrants and beyond. And for those who don't know, registrants is the collective term for CEnvs and REnv Techs. This webinar is the second of a three-part series based around the topic of a sustainable built environment. Today we focus on laying the foundations for healthy homes and buildings. So I'd like to take this opportunity to introduce Andrew Thompson. Andrew is a Chartered Environmentalist and is the Senior Lecturer in Building Surveying at Anglia Ruskin University and is also a Fellow at RICS. Andrew, are you there?
I am indeed.
Excellent. I'll leave it up to you to introduce yourself a little bit more, if that's okay, and introduce your colleagues as well.
I'll do my own full introduction when it's my time to speak, but let me take this opportunity of introducing my two co-speakers today. Both have an international research pedigree, and just for your sort of background, sort of like interest, one of our speakers has literally is in the process of flying back from Brazil, and the other has literally just landed back from speaking at an international conference in Iceland. So the topics that are being sort of covered today are their latest research that is generating sort of considerable interest, not just within the UK, but wider afield. So the first speaker is Dr. Miriam Imman. She's a civil engineer by background. She did her PhD in water systems engineering at Exeter University, and she will be talking specifically about flood resilience. The second speaker is going to be Professor Keith Jones. He did his PhD at Heriot-Watt in bonding mechanisms between reinforced steel and concrete. He then became a full-time academic, starting off with what was Thames Polytechnic, that became the University of Greenwich. And in 2002, he became the reader in sustainable buildings. In 2007, he became Professor of Facilities Management, and he is currently the Research Director here at Anglia Ruskin University. And he will be talking about an international project that he's just concluded called Liquifax, and how that the decision-making tools and the management systems that have come out of that can be used for asset and property management purposes. So, taking us into our first speaker.
Hello everyone, I'm Dr. Mariam Imani, Senior Lecturer in Civil Engineering at Anglia Ruskin University. And today I will be talking about resilience-driven SUDS planning as a multi-objective problem. There has been a paradigm shift to SUDS planning from a very engineering discipline concern towards a more multifunctional, multidisciplinary collaboration type with values to the society, an application in integrated water management, cost-effective solutions, so on and so forth. The motivation behind this talk mainly has been related to a project we completed in collaboration with Brazil. December, January, February are usually very wet periods in Brazil. Over the past few years, they have experienced very wet season, basically. And perhaps the latest one was this January and February 2020, that on 12th of February, for example, Sao Paulo city experienced 12 centimeters of rain in less than 24 hours, leading to a lot of flooding around the city, a lot of landslides, as you can see, as a result of that. The city of Sao Paulo, which is the case study in the state of Sao Paulo, and we are going to focus on that today. On 6th of February, for example, civil defense has been called as a result of around 30 millimeters of rain in less than 45 minutes, leading to this flooding that you can see in one of the hotspots in the area, damages to the roads, and also interruption to daily life in the area. The case study that we are going to focus on that is one of the contributor catchments that contributes to flooding in one of the hotspots in the city. There are two other catchments are contributing to the flooding and water contamination issues in these spots when flash rains happens. Minereño River or catchment is the one that we are going to focus on. That is a very small catchment, 7 kilometers square. Total length of its main river, Minereño River, is around 3 kilometers. It's a very steep catchment. The land users, over 50% of the land use around the area are illegal settlements with poor or no connection to sewage system, and discharging through these streams to this Minereño River, highly contaminated, and because it's very steep and this poor maintenance of the main channel of the river can lead to flooding in case of flash rains. Also, there is a high rate of sedimentation in this river, washed away from upstream towards downstream, and this basically roundabout on the junction here, again leading to exacerbating the flooding condition when they happen. Stormwater management generally in Brazil is separated from the sewage system, but there are illegal connections that combine these two, and there is no strategy or plan for combined sewage system management in the area. Traditionally very focused on water quantity and flooding and less attention to water quality aspects. The use of SUDS in general is new and is still very limited. For example, only recently a minimum of 15% SUDS coverage in new developments is needed, according to the council. We've had a series of workshops with them to identify other challenges around SUDS planning, that some of them have been outlined in this slide. So our project, in collaboration with the University of Sao Paulo and local authorities, aim to develop a resilience-informed decision-making framework through incorporating SUDS into urban planning. For that, we looked at it as a multi-objective problem. We primarily focused on water quality, flooding, and SUDS incorporation and its life cost, and also quality of life index. So the multi-objective problem aims to maximize flood resilience, water quality resilience, and minimizing SUDS life cycle, construction costs, and maintenance costs using the cost figures in UK documents, because these documents, they don't exist in Brazil. And all these engineering solutions, pay-to-front solutions, will be assessed with an index we developed called Improved Quality of Life Index. Feasibility map for SUDS and consultation with locals have been provided. primarily perhaps the most suitable, feasible SUDS option due to the deprivation we've got in this area is rain barrel, the cheap, low maintenance option. Green roofs, bioretention, grass width, and permeable pavements are the other options were identified as the most suitable solutions in the area. Thousands of evaluations have been made in order to find the best solutions using evolutionary algorithms. And as you can see here, well, obviously, you can make a lot of observations out of the results, but I can highlight a few ones that, for example, with the solutions, when you have a maximum spending or maximum cost, there is a good correlation of that with water quality resilience. Means with spending more, you can get a better or higher water quality resilience, and that makes sense because the most effective solutions for promotion of water quality resilience are the most expensive solutions. While this is not the case necessarily about flood resilience. Additionally, again, lower spending or lower cost, well, obviously will give you a lower water quality resilience, but it doesn't make much difference in terms of promotion of flood resilience control. Same story, when you have a maximum flood resilience, there is a reasonable correlation with water quality resilience. You're not going to get necessarily the maximum water quality resilience. And also, to get the maximum flood resilience, you may not need to spend more than the case that you spend for promotion of water quality resilience, basically. And these are exactly the trade-offs between the decisions that, and depends on the really decision makers' preferences and the conditions. So these are pretty much around the three main objectives we assumed from an engineering environmental point of view. The heat maps provided just to show the correlation and the paradigm shift of the solutions from upstream to downstream. When you can see when you gradually move towards downstream, due to the nature of the catchment, which is a very steep catchment, and at the very same time you have sometimes contradictory objectives. So you have a water quality resilience, you have a flood resilience. You will see the upstream catchments primarily they have more of a type, I would say, bioretention, permeable pavement vegetation swell. Perhaps because permeable pavements are one of the solutions that have a higher cost, and also they play a key role in source control and play a key role in attenuation of flood peaks. And same story applies when you get to more expanding and towards more downstream was again options like rain balance, green roof vegetation swells are getting quite popular. Perhaps I can map that here in this slide for you, that when you have a trade-off of options like water quality resilience, permeable pavement play a key role in controlling and managing in those surface runoff pollutions, basically. And as you can see here, they are quite, it's become a very popular option in upstream catchment. Well, initially we expected more of a rain barrel because of those affordability issue, but it becomes a very popular option. First, for source control as a source control option that gives time, minimizes reduces the travel time in this steep catchment to the outlet of the catchment. At the very same, we can manage water quality as well, or bioretention, although it's possible to include bioretention somewhere in downstream, but it seems that because of the steepness of the catchment, again, bioretention becomes a popular option right in upstream as a SUDS for flood control right at the source. And again, and that shows a trade-off amongst objectives and depends on really decision makers how they want to proceed and adopt and use the SUDS option in different parts of the catchment. That brings me to the improved quality of life index in this project. In the UK document, in the policy, embedded in National Planning Policy Framework, including some consideration of quality of life, but only on major developments. But when it comes to locals, it's advisory rather than binding. And in decision-making, such in major applications referred to lead local flood authorities for consideration. And when it comes to SUDS benefit or is quality of life as a whole, if we define it, some benefits are measurable, quantifiable, and there are studies around that. Some measures, some benefits are not quantifiable, they are quite subjective, and the question is, can we really create a quality of life index that could be quantified and used for reevaluation of engineering solutions? We came up with a scoring system, simple scoring system in 3 categories of public health well-being, social well-being, ecosystem services, with a weight that is going to be 0.1 for direct benefits, and potential benefits were recognized after a series of consultation, and 0.05 for each such option. We reevaluated some of our solutions, engineering solutions, and observations are quite interesting. With spending more, you're not necessarily getting the maximum quality of life index. So, for example, the options that are very suitable, very good in terms of maximizing flood resilience may not be necessarily the best options for maximizing quality of life index. Again, any observations you're making here is not necessarily, you cannot be necessarily generalized, but you can see some trends in that. And the critic is, it can be criticized for not quantifying the identified benefits. And that's the question still. Finally, I would like to share a resilience-driven game that we developed for SUDS planning in this project. The case study area was gamified. Again, is a gamified environment. Flood resilience or flood resilience improvement and the cost of SUDS adoption with different types of SUDS have been applied to that. It gives a user an experience of a more user-friendly environment rather than using sophisticated models, and to see how adoption of different types of SUDS, different parts of the catchment can contribute to flood resilience improvement, and what's the cost implication. And with the scoring system, you can measure and evaluate the goodness of the solutions that you have picked. We are at the early stages, but I thought that it would be interesting to share that we are in the process of again promoting this and we use this game in our workshops to give it an experience to our participants in the workshops, both in the UK and also in Brazil, and we are still working on this game to improve it as part of the innovation could be made in this area. Thank you very much for your listening.
So everyone, that concludes the first presentation. What we'll now be doing is just changing slides and screens over so that Keith Jones can start his presentation. Over to you, Keith.
Thank you. I will share my screen. I'm going to talk to you about the challenge of improving resilience of the built environment to disaster events. I'm going to take a slightly more theoretical perspective than Mariam did, but nevertheless, it's still based upon real data collected from 2 projects, which I will introduce as we go through. So the context. According to the UN, there are 3.5 billion people currently living in cities. This number is due to rise to about 5 billion people by 2030. As such, the challenge to cities as they become larger and more densely populated is to cope with the impacts that disasters have, not only on the physical attributes of the city, but more importantly, on the communities that occupy the cities. I'm going to look from 2 focus points. I gave this title a few weeks ago, so I said from earthquakes to floods. Maybe given our current situation in the UK, it would have been better to go from floods to earthquakes, but never mind. So I'm going to look at the lessons that can be learned by examining flood issues and earthquake issues, and in the earthquake issues, specifically looking at liquefaction. Liquefaction is a phenomena that occurs when, due to ground shaking, there is a rise in pore water pressure in certain soil types. As a consequence, the ground can lose its strength and its stiffness, and so buildings can tip or topple or sink or slide, as you can see in the slide. The problems that I was looking at is how do I predict those potential impacts, and how do I look at reducing their effect on society? I'm going to start with the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. The Sendai Framework is a UN document It was established and adopted in 2015. And it takes a disaster risk reduction approach to understanding the impact that natural disasters have on communities. Its stated aim is to reduce the disaster risk and losses in terms of lives, livelihoods, health, in the economic, physical, social, cultural, and environmental aspects of people, businesses, communities, and societies. So Sendai is not an engineering approach. It is not a sociological approach. It is a multidisciplinary approach, which treats and views societies as a system of systems. And it looks at how different parts of systems interact with each other. And what I've been looking at is what affects both individual systems, but also what collectively affects the resilience of the system of systems. In turning that sort of high-level concept into a series of tools, the Sendai Framework has developed based around a series of principles. It says that resilience is a shared responsibility between government sectors and stakeholders, and that each of these have a different role to play, but nevertheless, the combined resilience of all of them is what makes the overall community system resilient. The Sendai Framework is based on the protection of people, their health, property, and livelihoods, and considers culture as well as physical assets and the environment. It assumes that coordination is acquired within and across sectors, and particularly between stakeholders. It acknowledges that hazards normally come as multi-hazards, either as cascading hazards, so landslides result from raised pore water pressure, or from earthquakes, or from flooding. And so you can't just isolate and look at a single risk, a single hazard at a single time, but you have to consider the combined effect. It also has a very important principle that in order to improve resilience going forward, you must adopt a build back better philosophy. It is no good just reinstating what is already there before the disaster event happens, or the next time that event occurs, you'll have exactly the same problem. And of all of the principles that I've been looking at, that last one seems to be the most difficult from a built environment perspective. So that is the one I'm going to spend a little bit more time focusing on in the next 10 minutes. To support the application of the principles in the framework, the UN have developed a tool for measuring the resilience of cities. It's called the 10 Essentials. And basically what this tool does is to identify 10 categories, 10 sets of activities that taken together define the antecedent resilience of a community. And by that I mean its existing resilience of the community. The first three are around corporate and city governance and the processes and procedures that are in place. The next set are around planning, both for new work and for the existing built environment. And the final two are about the response to a disaster event. The scorecard comprises 118 different criteria in each of, across all 10 of these essentials. Each criteria specifies an action and is scored from 0 to 5 against two scenarios, a most probable scenario and a most severe scenario. 0 means that no preparation actions have been taken. 5 means that they are fully prepared for this particular aspect of the criteria. Collectively, the criteria describe the level of resilience of each essential. So for essential 1, the criteria collectively give you a measurement of the degree of organization that you have in place for dealing with disaster resilience. They also identify areas where you may need to further investigate and improve your approach. So as well as providing a quantitative score, they also provide a qualitative framework for decision makers to actually look at what else can be done and what needs to be done in the future. If you then combine the scores across all 10 essentials, you can collectively get a score for the overall resilience of the city or region. What I've done in 2 projects is to look at what those essentials and those criteria actually mean, and to try to look at them through the perspective of how do we improve the existing built environment. So I've looked at it from the point of view of the challenge to built environment professionals, be they planners, architects, engineers, surveyors, facilities managers, or other parties to our profession. I've asked the question about whether we understand what makes a system resilient, and if we do we know what our role is within that system? Do we understand the risks? Do we understand the risks from the perspective of performance? So we might understand the physical risks to a series of built assets, but do we know the impact that those risks have on the service level that those assets can deliver? Because ultimately, society relies on the function of assets, not on the assets themselves. So do we make that link between physical damage and functionality? If we do, how do we justify that link? And do we understand how to design, construct, and operate solutions that reduce vulnerability and improve resilience? Not only today, but also against future potential risks, and in this case, particularly climate change risks. So I start with a very simple view of the building life cycle. This is one which facilities managers tend to use. So at some point in time, a client has a need. They understand and they identify the need for a building, and they specify that with an expectation of a certain value or certain performance for their organization. That need is then met through design and construction, and at some point the building is ready to be occupied and is handed over. At the point it's handed over, it starts to deteriorate. It physically deteriorates, it socially deteriorates, it economically deteriorates. Periodically, we try to redress that deterioration through maintenance and refurbishment, and traditionally maintenance is seen as a process to return the system, the built asset, back to its original condition or its original value. The cycle repeats, and there comes a point where returning it back to its original is not actually going to satisfy the changed needs of the organization, because as an asset ages, so the expectations of the owner or the occupier increases, their demands change, their needs from the building changes. And so we refurbish. Ideally, we would refurbish to bring it back to satisfy the needs of the owner as of today. But that's rarely possible, because the legacy of our design decisions made right back at the beginning tend to limit our ability. So we have an obsolescence gap. And that process continues until that obsolescence gap becomes too great. And then we either demolish and start again, or we fundamentally change its use. So if you accept that that is the generic life cycle of a building, what happens if you have a disaster event? So what happens at some point if the built asset faces disaster, which causes an immediate and rapid reduction in its value or its performance? What about its return paths? So if we return back to normal, what is the time scale? What is the cost? We could return back to the refurbishment model. Again, what is the time scale? What is the cost? If we apply the Sendai principles, then we would return back to its current needs. So again, what is the time scale? What is the cost? And the decision about whether the red, amber, or green route, the route that you take, depends upon your vulnerability and your resilience. So the question becomes, how can we improve the resilience of the existing built assets if they are exposed to a disaster event. So this is based on 2 projects. Liquefact, which was a €5 million EU project looking at earthquake-induced liquefaction, and the Crew project, which was a £1.5 million UK project looking at community resilience to extreme weather. And for both of these projects, we tried to look at the business decisions. So if you are the asset manager responsible for the life cycle management of a building or a piece of physical infrastructure, how can you integrate improvements to resilience into your decision making? So we need to start with some definitions. Vulnerability is the conditions determined by the physical, social, economic, and environmental factors or processes which increase susceptibility of an asset to a hazard. Resilience is the ability of a system, community, or society exposed to a hazard to resist, absorb, accommodate, adapt to, transform, and recover from the effects of a hazard in a timely and efficient manner. Coping capacity is the ability for the systems to change, to adapt, to meet new conditions brought about by the disturbance that fundamentally change the system. And those definitions come from the UN. So what does that mean to a stakeholder? What does that mean to a household? What does that mean to a business? What does that mean to a policy group? Well, we need to understand vulnerability. We need to understand resilience, and we need to understand coping capacity against a hazard. We know from history that they are all interrelated, that they are not independent activities, but that they are interconnected. And each stakeholder has its own perspective on each of those. We also know that the community is made up of different stakeholder groups. I'm just showing 3. There are actually far more. But we know the community resilience is some combination of the individual stakeholder resilience, which can either support or inhibit each other's, each different stakeholders groups to collectively come together to create community resilience. So what affects vulnerability and resilience of stakeholders? What influences the relationships between stakeholders? And how do these relationships support or undermine community resilience? Those are fundamental questions to professionals working within the built environment, faced with the challenge of improving the existing system. Now, there's a piece of theory developed by American professor Susan Cutter in 2008 that explains the process by which a place is affected by a disaster event. She starts by saying that there is an antecedent perspective, a combination of the existing social, built environment and natural systems that give an inherent vulnerability and provide an inherent resilience to whatever hazard you're looking at. You then have the hazard events. So you have an event which is characterized by its impact and its effects. In earthquakes, that would be its ground shaking motion. In flooding, it could be the speed of onset of the flood or the depth of water. Most systems have coping responses. In earthquakes, we design earthquake resilient buildings. In flooding, we have temporary resistance measures, which we can use to keep water out of our assets. So the event itself and the ability and the successfulness of our coping mechanisms affect the hazard impacts. So we then have an impact of a hazard, which affects the system, and then the system either has to absorb it, and if it does, it can recover relatively quickly, providing it has the adaptive capacity or the coping capacity. Or if it doesn't have the capacity, it doesn't absorb it, and it recovers very slowly. If it fails to have any capacity, then it recovers slowly. And because we're supposed to learn, we have new mitigations, which change the antecedent conditions, and we have new preparedness measures, which mean that next time we have the same event, we should be better. So this was the starting point to ask the questions that I've just referred to. How could we improve community resilience? So what we did was we took that very high theory and we turned it into built environment business tools. Tools which we could use to measure the effectiveness of our mitigations at each of these stages. So what is antecedent resilience? Well, it is a complex combination. It's actually a complex system. It's a complex system of systems. So how do we measure the antecedent resilience to a disaster event? Well, we use the scorecard. The problem is that the scorecard is generic, and so it doesn't relate to a specific event. So what we did was we interviewed 42 stakeholders, experts across Europe, about how an earthquake would affect each of the criteria in the scorecard, what we could do against each of those criteria to raise them from a low score. Remember I said the score goes from 0 to 5. And how we could combine together these, because they're not as equally important as each other. So we use a multi-criteria method, an expert judgment method to create a score. And we're now validating this against a hypothetical case study set somewhere in Southern Europe. And these results will be published later next month. Once we knew what the existing antecedent resilience was, we then need to look at susceptibility and risk models. So how do we translate the hazards into risk? So we looked at mapping, microzonation mapping or macrozonation. These are earthquake maps. You could have the same maps, and we did the same maps for flooding. We look at failure modes. So we look at the direct impact of the hazard on a building. And again, these are fragility curves, which are used for earthquake mapping, so that you can read off against a range of potential scenarios, the damage ratio. And again, we did similar things for flooding. So you can convert the event characteristics into physical impacts on the assets. Then you need to look at how vulnerable these assets are and how their resilience could be improved. So we looked at scoring mechanisms. So resilience is not just physical, it's a combination of organizational activities, technical systems, and the service design that the piece of infrastructure, the built asset or the road or the power distribution network is supposed to do. So we developed our own scorecard, which looked at preparedness, absorption, recovery, and adaptability. So again, we could look at how ready, how prepared today were each of these organizations to cope with the activity. Just knowing what's going to happen and knowing what we can do about it isn't enough, however, because we need then to actually put those mitigations into practice. And the problem then becomes one of cost benefit. So how can we justify spending money today against risks and hazards that may not materialize for many years? In the context of flooding, that's a slightly easier situation because flooding occurs, and unfortunately, regularly, quite frequently on short turnaround periods. Earthquakes, however, don't. There are some parts of Europe that haven't had an earthquake for 80 odd years. However, we know that they are due, and when they do come, the impact will be catastrophic. So we developed a cost-benefit tool, looking at individual assets, looking at collection of assets, which could be used to work out whether or not to actually take action. And finally, we integrated all of those into a decision-making framework. So I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on this because it's a little bit complex. So we have a series of assets, individual assets. And for each individual asset, we have a threat. In this case, is the asset located in an earthquake zone? Is the asset located in a flood zone? What will the impact of an earthquake or flood be on that asset, physical impact? What is the level of risk to that asset? So how does it affect its functionality and its ability to perform? So what is the loss of operational functionality given that threat level? And does that loss of functionality have a significant impact onto the overall system that built asset is part of? So if that built asset is part of a power distribution network, how does its loss affect the resilience of the whole network? And to do that, you have to consider all of the assets together. And so in this box, you have a system approach for the risk and the hazard. You then have the same set of questions about your business continuity and resilience planning. So how can you lower vulnerability of the asset? How can you improve resilience of the asset? What is the cost of each of those mitigations? How do you prioritize when to take action? How do you integrate that into an asset management plan? Because we intervene in assets over their life cycle. So when do we intervene? When do we integrate that into the building life cycle? And again, we do that across assets. So we have a system level, a subsystem level. First subsystem might be healthcare, critical in an earthquake scenario for community resilience. We'll have another subsystem, could be power supply. We have another subsystem. This could be transportation network. And so ultimately, you have to combine the results from each of these subsystems to get the overall community resilience. And that's what we've been doing through the scorecard. That's the same model now for flooding and for climate change. So it's a slightly different way of expressing it, but you have your antecedent, your current conditions based upon historic events and flood mapping. You have your future scenarios based upon whichever climate change scenario you feel most comfortable using. Those together inform your risk appraisal. So your impact matrices, the impact of flooding, and we did extreme weather and overheating as well as another climate change analysis. Your cost benefits, your contingency planning, and your adaptation plans. And again, this is a system of systems thing. So you need to combine all of these into your built asset management plan. Finally, we turned both of those frameworks into a series of built asset management questions. So 10 steps to improving the resilience of your built assets to disaster hazards. So set goals and operationalize objectives, identify susceptibility, assess level of risk, estimate the damage profile. Those are all fairly standard. Any risk assessment would do those. The one that was lacking in most of these was step 5, that physical link to performance and functionality. So that's what we had to do new. Combining the loss of performance on community resilience was also a problem because most risk systems assess the risk within the boundaries of the organization. And we're saying you need to look outside your organization. So that was a challenge. What can we do to mitigate, either reduce vulnerability or improve resilience? How can we cost them? And how can we then integrate them into an options appraisal process, which we can use to develop a mitigation plan? Once we've done that, how do we go back to 4 in order to see whether our improved system would reduce the loss of functionality and therefore improve resilience? So steps 4 to 10 are cyclical and iterative. So what did we take away from all of that? Improved community resilience to disaster events is a shared responsibility. As built environment professionals, we need to understand the relationships between the physical impacts of a disaster on our assets and their functionality. This is critical to identifying appropriate mitigation interventions. And we must recognize that some of these interventions might not be technical. So redeployment of a service might be the way forward. We did an example of a hospital which had 4 buildings located in an earthquake zone. Because liquefaction is very localized, 2 of the buildings would have been damaged, 2 of them wouldn't. So one of the mitigations was actually over the next 15 years to relocate the critical patient services from buildings which were at risk to buildings which weren't at risk, and to locate the other way, the back office functions, from the buildings that weren't at risk to those that were at risk. So that was a service design and a service delivery perspective. There are generic tools which we can use to help our clients understand all of these issues, but they're generic and they need to be contextualized. And that's where we have a responsibility to society to actually contextualize those tools, not just against our narrow discipline perspective, so not just from an engineering perspective, but to actually be part of a multidisciplinary group. And I believe it's our responsibility to lead that multidisciplinary group, that the built environment professionals are best placed to be the focus, because we have to combine engineering science and social science if we are to come up with resilience approaches. So thank you. Thank you very much for watching.
So everyone, there's going to be a quick changeover in slides, and then I will go straight into my presentation. So hello everyone, I'm Andrew Thompson. I'm a Chartered Environmentalist, and I examine the Chartered Environmentalist pathway via the RICS route. What I'm going to be doing is looking at housing and some recent changes in legislation, but drawing it into the sustainable context. And for you as Chartered Environmentalists, you already have a professional qualification. You've gone and taken on a second layer of chartered designation. So typically you have done an additional master's level study, and therefore in life you are, so we say, a more matured professional. What are the challenges facing your business? How, rather than just looking at sustainable development as an academic concept, how as a chartered environmentalist can you be part of the solution and the problem? And what I will be covering in my presentation is how engaging in professional research can help you go from just being a reactive practitioner to being a proactive solver of some of the biggest problems that we have facing us in society. Now, when we talk about housing, because of the width of society membership, I'm just going to go through a few basic points of, so we say, misunderstanding. When we are looking at the existing sort of property stock, the building regulations, the Building Act doesn't really help us. The building regulations are primarily aimed at the new build sector. They trigger for new build, they trigger for major material change of use. In the existing built environment sector, they really are, it's the legislation of last resort. So building regulations triggers when there's a dangerous structure notice. And there's, so we say, a long way between what is new build and a dangerous structure. I hear the cry coming back from the audience, but didn't we have a mandatory code dealing with sustainable development, all linked to housing? Well, yes, we did. Going back to 2002, BRE created Eco Homes, which was a voluntary scheme. This turned into the mandatory Code for Sustainable Homes, which in 2015 ceased to be mandatory. And in the new build sector, we now have another voluntary scheme, which is the BRE's housing quality mark. However, for the context of what we're talking about this afternoon, these are all new build. These do not help an occupier or assist anyone in the landlord or tenant relationship. So are we building healthy homes? Well, this was the challenge put by the Minister for Housing and Local Government for the National Assembly of Wales last year, where she called out the housing developers. And she basically challenged them and asked them the question, are housing firms building the slums of the future? Yesterday, the government announced that this concern over the quality of new build is now reaching such a problem in our society that there is a need for a new body to be created specifically dealing with the quality standards and safety standards within new build. But what's coming through our system? Well, the image that you see there and the reference deals with a planning permission that was granted last year by the concept of permitted development. Our system is allowing that unit, which is a former industrial unit under permitted development, to be converted into residential units. Some of these residential units have no windows and no natural ventilation. Whilst refused by the local planning authority, the decision was appealed. It went to the planning inspector, and the planning inspector was unable to defend that refusal and had to give permission. And this is because of how our planning legislation has been worded in terms of permitted development. There was nothing within section P2 that allowed the inspector to refuse permission. So when we start talking about new build, do not assume that everything that is new is shiny. And this is starting to have implications across society. To understand why we have the problem that we have, you have to understand our system. And to understand our system, it's sometimes helpful to go back to the Latin maxims. Caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. Or as it is applied in the landlord and tenant relationship, let the tenant beware. Caveat lessee. So why is this a problem? Why is this something that chartered environmentalists should be concerned over and giving as much attention to as other parts of the sustainable development criteria? Well, the quote that I'm now going to read you comes directly from the all-party working group's Healthy Homes and Buildings report of 2019. And it's quite a timely warning of the issues that we are facing. And it states as follows. Children in cold homes are more than twice as likely to suffer a respiratory problem than those living in warm homes. More than 1 in 4 adolescents living in cold homes are at risk of multiple mental health problems, compared to 1 in 20 in warm homes and cold housing. Are also associated with increased incidence of colds and flu, which, as well as killing people, are known to worsen conditions such as arthritis and rheumatism. Now, these are the reports and figures coming from both the Building Research Establishment and the NHS, to a politically neutral body within our like Parliament. So again, dealing with the misunderstanding that commonly exists within this area. Whilst building regulations are a minimum standard, they are a minimum standard that applies to new build or seriously materially change of use property, so a property that's gone through a major sort of refurbishment. It doesn't deal with the existing housing stock. So if a house was built to a poor standard already, that problem remains in our system as long as that unit is in our system. The building regulations also do not apply in a retrospective way. So again, I hear the cry come back to me, what of this thing, decent homes? Well, decent homes, again, whilst it is below building regulations, it is perfectly possible to occupy in our current system a property that is below decent home like standard, but it is still considered to be fit for habitation. And therefore, there is nothing stopping a landlord putting that property onto the market. So when we look at this like, academically, the problem that we have is something is stopping the classic circle of building obsolescence from operating as it was originally sort of envisaged in free market like terms. Something is taking older properties, so rather than being refurbished and improved, they are being locked into a state of unfitness. So if we look at that in table terms, what we're talking about here as a problem is the yellow layer. And you'll see there's a whole range of standards that are commonly like talked about in the environmental like world, where we aspire to design to higher like standards that is not addressing existing building stock. So when you start looking at the existing building stock, you have to look at the landlord-tenant relationship. The private rented sector, as it has evolved in recent years and when it is now being talked about as an important segment in our housing market, what we are talking about are properties that are on 10 years of a landlord-tenant relationship of less than 7 years. Now, we have had for a long time obligations on landlords to keep properties in repair, but the system has not operated in the way that outsiders to the problem would think. And whilst the minimum fitness standards can be traced back to the Housing Acts of 1957, the problem that we've had until recently is a landlord was able to rebut any fitness standard claim against them because the right was pegged against the annual rent that that property was able to achieve. And yes, these figures are right, £80 for London and £52 for elsewhere. In part, this is why in the Housing Act of 2014, the fitness standards were swept away, and a concept known as the Housing Health and Safety Rating System was introduced. This worked on a risk assessment rather than a minimum standard like basis. However, it was only administered by the Environmental Health Officer. The system has been reviewed formally twice, and in its last review, which concluded in July of last year, the system was concluded to be broken. And we are currently awaiting the government to announce the results of its scoping report in terms of what it's going to do to replace the current system. Well, you may have missed in the parliamentary Brexit debates, one of the things that they were able to achieve in 2018 was the introduction of the Homes Fitness for Human Habitation legislation. For new leases, this took effect on the 20th of March of 2019, and importantly, in terms of where we sit at the moment, the key date, all new leases will be bound by this new legislation from the 20th of March of this year. So how does this change the world? It brings in the ability of professional consultants to support and take a tenant when they have a rogue landlord situation, should any of the following areas be identified, or any of the prescribed hazards within the 2004 system, a tenant can now commence their own county court action independent of the Environmental Health Officer. The problem: if a tenant goes down the new county court route, whereas in the former system, if they had gone to the Environmental Health Officer, they were protected from revenge eviction, also known as a Section 21 eviction, that safeguard does not exist via the new county court route. So it's going to be interesting post the 20th of March, whether what we see is that when potential tenant clients come to us asking for us to help them in terms of doing this expert witness reporting on substandard housing, whether or not they will be exposing themselves to revenge eviction. Now, when we look at this like academically, we can start adopting systems like thinking, like methods. And this brings me back to the first two like speakers. As someone who is going down the professional doctorate like route, as a chartered environmentalist, think of the opportunities like to you if you were able to work your problem for your own sector and be surrounded by researchers who were familiar with and able to assist with dealing with advanced and complex like problem solving. How would that help you move forward in terms of your endeavor? The difference between a professional doctorate and a traditional like PhD is that the expectation is that you are in work, so you're not giving up your professional career, you're not giving up your day job. This is something that you are doing in tandem with the normal like process. So for myself, my journey started last year, and tomorrow is my first hand-in date for paper like number 1. If the DPROF route sounds of interest like to you, the next start date is September 2020. It's a 3 to 5 year pathway, and you have to complete within 6 like years. And that takes us into any questions.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And thank you very much to Keith and Miriam for your talks as well. They were fantastic. Very interesting talks indeed. We probably could have got 3 separate webinars out of the 3 different talks, and to be entirely honest. So we have run out of time, unfortunately, for questions. However, if you do have questions for either Keith, Miriam, or Andrew, please do send them through to me. My email address was at the start of the webinar, and we will see if we can get some answers to you. But some very interesting talks there, and I hope you very much enjoyed them. We are going to conclude the webinar really. So a huge thank you again to Andrew, Keith, and Miriam. I hope you enjoyed presenting as well.
Yes.
Excellent. Good. So whilst we have you, just a few things to note. The next webinar in this series of webinars, so under the umbrella of a sustainable built environment, is on the 12th of March. That's to do with HS2. We have 2 talks there around soil management and the sustainable construction of HS2. And then we have our next series of webinars, which has the umbrella title of Climate Change, a 2020 Perspective, which will be with you in April, potentially May. We shall see how things go. If you want to see recordings of webinars that we've done previously and this recording, it will be available in the coming days on our YouTube channel and at socenv.org.uk/webinars. So the first webinar within this series is on there now, and this webinar will be on there in the next couple of days. Just a very quick note for your diary, which is actually next week. We will be at Future Build, so the Society for the Environment has a stand there. And we also have our Chief Executive, Emma, is doing a talk, and our Chair of the Society for the Environment is also doing a talk there. Emma's on Tuesday next week, and Will is on Thursday. If you check out our communications via Twitter and so on, you'll be able to find out all about that. And our stand is B157. Due to time, we'll skip over this slightly, but we are looking for experts to speak on the topics of biodiversity, getting to net zero, and managing resource materials and waste for our upcoming awards and lectures event on the 4th of June. Please get in touch with me if you want to be part of that agenda. We also have nominations opening very soon for you to become the Environmental Professional of the Year 2020. Again, look out for details. And if you want to listen to more about what a Chartered Environmentalist is or a registered environmental technician, check out our podcasts, and you can have a listen on your commute to work and back maybe, or maybe in your lunch break. So check out the website that's on your screen now. And apart from a huge thank you again to Andrew, Keith and Miriam, thank you very, very much for watching. This has been a Society for the Environment webinar, and we shall see you in the next one. Thank you very much.